We have tamed the word compassion. We print it on greeting cards. We use it in corporate mission statements. We treat it as a polite, quiet feeling of sympathy. When someone is hurting, we nod. We feel a brief pang of sadness, and we call that compassion. And because this is how we use the word in English, this is exactly how we read it in the Bible. When you read the Gospels, you will find this word constantly surrounding Jesus. He looks at a hungry crowd, and the text says he had compassion. He sees a widow burying her only son, and he is moved with compassion. Two blind men cry out by the side of the road, and Jesus feels compassion. In our modern minds, we picture a serene Jesus, a Jesus who pauses, offers a gentle smile of pity, perhaps lets out a soft sigh, and decides to help. We imagine a God who observes our brokenness from a safe, sterile distance. But that is not what the text actually says. The English translation is not necessarily wrong, but it is entirely too small. It has been sanitized. It has been stripped of its force. The English word compassion originally comes from two Latin words, com, meaning with, and pati, meaning to suffer. At its very root, the word was meant to describe suffering alongside someone, but over centuries of modern use, that sharp edge has worn down. Today, compassion is often just a synonym for pity. Pity is safe. Pity looks down from a balcony. Pity feels bad for the beggar on the street, drops a coin in the cup, and walks away unchanged. When we project that kind of polite pity onto Jesus, we distort the gospel. We begin to believe that God tolerates us, feels a little sad for our struggles, but ultimately remains emotionally untouched by our tragedies. This is the danger of reading a sanitized translation. It sanitizes God. If we misunderstand this single word, we misunderstand the very heart of Christ. We miss the shocking reality of how he actually interacts with disease, with grief, and with spiritual exile. The gospel writers wanted to make sure we did not make this mistake. When they recorded how Jesus reacted to human suffering, they did not use a word for polite sympathy. They did not use a word for a passing emotional thought. They reached for a word that was graphic, visceral, even violent. They chose a word that describes a physical agony so intense that it actually alters the body. This is one of the most profound translation gaps in the entire New Testament. We read a word that feels soft, but the original Greek readers encountered a word that felt like a sudden punch to the stomach. Every time you see the word compassion in your English New Testament, it is standing over a crater. It is covering up a reaction that broke the social and religious rules of the first century world. It drove Jesus to touch things he was not supposed to touch. It caused him to halt funeral processions. It forced him to look at the outcasts of society not with religious disgust, but with an overwhelming, physical tearing in his own chest. To understand how Jesus actually responds to your pain, you have to strip away the greeting card version of compassion. You have to go back to the original language. But to understand what the gospel writers actually meant, we have to look past modern psychology and look at the anatomy of the ancient world. In the modern West, when we want to talk about deep emotion, we point to our chest. We love with all our heart. Our hearts are broken. We follow our hearts. But in the ancient world, the heart was viewed very differently. In ancient Jewish and Greek thought, the heart was primarily the control center. It was the seat of the mind, the will, and decision-making. You reasoned with your heart. You chose with your heart. But your deepest emotions, your uncontrollable grief, your overwhelming yearning, those did not live in your chest. They lived lower. They lived in your gut. And this anatomical reality is the key to understanding the compassion of Jesus. The Greek verb that the gospel writers use to describe his compassion is splagchnizomai. It is a heavy, rough-sounding word. It comes from the root noun splagnon, and literally translated, splagnon means the inward parts, the intestines, the internal organs. When the King James Bible was translated in 1611, the translators were extremely literal with this word. That is why, in older English translations, you will read phrases like the bowels of mercies or the bowels of compassion. To our modern ears, that sounds strange. It sounds unspiritual, even a little uncomfortable, but to the ancient reader, it was profoundly accurate. Think about how your physical body actually responds to sudden trauma. When you receive devastating news, where do you feel it first? You do not feel it in your mind. you feel it in your stomach. It drops. It twists. It knots up. When you see your child in sudden danger, or when you watch someone you love suffering in a hospital bed, you feel a physical ache in your core. You feel sick to your stomach. That involuntary physical reaction, that gut-wrenching agony that you cannot control. That is the exact meaning of splagchnizomai. It is an emotion so intense it bypasses the intellect and alters the state of your physical body. And this concept actually has deep roots in the Hebrew Bible. In Hebrew, one of the primary words for deep mercy and compassion is raham. This Hebrew word shares its root with the word for a mother's womb. When the Old Testament speaks of God having compassion on his people, it is using a word that invokes the fierce, protective, inescapable bond between a mother and the life she carries inside her. It is not an idea. It is an ache, a deep, physical yearning. When the Gospel writers, who were writing in Greek, needed a word to describe how Jesus reacted to the brokenness of the world, they needed a word that carried that same intense, bodily reality. They did not choose a word related to feeling sad. They did not choose a word related to simple kindness. They chose a word that means your insides are being torn apart. When the text says Jesus had compassion, it is telling us that his stomach churned, his breath caught, his inward parts were physically twisted by the suffering he was witnessing. He did not look at human pain and offer a polite sigh from a distance. The pain of the world hit him squarely in the gut. This is the anatomy of divine emotion. We do not have a God who remains safely insulated from our tragedies. The incarnation means that God took on a human body and then allowed that body to physically ache at the sight of our ruin. But a word this intense cannot remain a private feeling. An emotion this violent always demands an immediate action. And when you take this visceral, gut-wrenching word and watch how it actually drives Jesus, the familiar stories of the Gospels suddenly read completely differently. Matthew is the first Gospel writer to introduce us to this gut-wrenching reaction. And he does it at the end of chapter 9. At this point in the narrative, Jesus has been moving relentlessly. He has been walking through all the towns and villages. He has been teaching in the synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. The demand on his time is absolute. The crowds are pressing in on every side. If you are a human being, there is a limit to how much need you can process. Compassion fatigue is a real psychological condition. When we are exposed to too much suffering, too many requests, too much brokenness, our emotional systems eventually shut down. We numb out. We pull away. But watch what happens to Jesus. Matthew chapter 9, verse 36. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. There is our word, splagchnizomai. When Jesus looks out over the sea of human faces, he does not feel compassion, fatigue. He does not feel annoyance. He does not look at the multitude and see a logistical problem to be managed. His gut twists, his inward parts physically ache. And notice why. Matthew says Jesus reacted this way because the people were harassed and helpless. In the original language, those two words are incredibly graphic. They do not just mean the people were a little confused or slightly tired. The words carry the image of being mangled, ripped apart, thrown down, and abandoned. Like sheep that have been attacked by wolves while the shepherds were sleeping. The religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees and the scribes, looked at these exact same crowds and saw something entirely different. They saw people who were uneducated in the law. They saw people who were ritually unclean. They saw a nuisance. They looked at the brokenness of the crowds with a quiet, religious disgust. But Jesus looks at the exact same people, and he is moved by a violent, tearing compassion. He is physically agonizing over their spiritual exile. This fundamentally changes how we understand the way God views our exhaustion. We often assume that God is disappointed when we are wandering. We imagine a God who crosses his arms and waits for us to get our lives together. We assume our brokenness is frustrating to him, but the text tells us something entirely different. When you are harassed by the world, when you are helpless, when you are spiritually mangled and thrown down, God is not annoyed with you. His reaction is splagchnizomai. He looks at your wandering, and he feels it in his gut. This is the first time the word appears in the Gospel of Matthew, and it establishes a massive theological truth. God's compassion is not limited. It is vast enough to cover entire cities. He can look at a massive, chaotic crowd of thousands of people and feel a deeply personal, inward agony for their restoration. But Jesus does not just feel this physical agony for large, anonymous crowds. It is one thing to feel a sweeping sense of compassion for a multitude. It is entirely another to let that feeling drive your hands. The word appears again in the Gospels, but this time, Jesus is not looking at a crowd. He is looking at the one person everyone else in the crowd was desperately trying to avoid. In the first chapter of Mark's Gospel, Jesus is approached by a man who was not supposed to be there. He is a man with leprosy. To understand the weight of this moment, you have to understand what leprosy meant in the ancient world. It was not just a medical condition. It was a sentence of complete social and religious exile. According to the book of Leviticus, a person with an infectious skin disease had to live outside the camp. They had to wear torn clothes. They had to leave their hair unkempt. They were required to cover the lower part of their face and shout, "Unclean, unclean," whenever anyone came near. This man had lost his family. He had lost his community. He had lost his ability to worship in the temple. For years, he had lost the simple experience of human touch. He was the walking dead, and yet, he breaks every rule of his society, and he approaches Jesus. He falls to his knees and makes a stunning statement. He does not ask Jesus if he has the power to heal him. He assumes the power is there. Instead, he questions the will of Jesus. He says, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." How should a holy man react to this? How should a first-century rabbi respond when severe ritual impurity suddenly invades his personal space? The religious instinct is to step back. The instinct is to protect your own purity. The instinct is to send the man away for breaking the law. But Mark chapter 1, verse 41 records the reaction of Jesus. Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Moved with compassion. Once again, the English translation softens the blow. The Greek word is splagchnizomai. Jesus looks at a man who is physically ruined, a man whom society has deemed dangerous and untouchable, and Jesus is hit in the gut. His inward parts twist with physical agony over the man's isolation and suffering. And notice what this gut-wrenching emotion forces Jesus to do. He reaches out his hand, and he touches him. He touches the man before he speaks the healing word. He touches the man while the man is still covered in the disease. This detail is profound. If Jesus only felt polite sympathy, he could have healed the man from 10 feet away. He had the power to simply speak a word and cleanse the disease without ever risking contact. That is what pity does. It solves the problem while keeping a safe distance. But splagchnizomai refuses to stay at a distance. This visceral, tearing compassion drives Jesus across the boundary of ritual purity. He steps directly into the man's uncleanness. He touches the untouchable. He breaks the social and religious rules of the day, because his gut-level love for this broken man is stronger than the ancient system of separation. For the first time in perhaps years, the outcast feels the warmth of another human hand, and it is the hand of God. This is what the word does. It proves that the purity of Jesus is contagious. When Jesus touches the man with leprosy, Jesus does not become unclean. The man becomes clean. The compassion of God is so potent, so heavy, that it absorbs our ruin and replaces it with wholeness. When we are isolated, when we feel ruined, when we believe we are too spiritually unclean for God anything to do with us, we assume God will keep his distance. We assume he is disgusted. But the text says he is moved in his gut. That is what the word does to social barriers. It shatters them. But what happens when this gut-wrenching compassion confronts the ultimate human tragedy? What happens when it faces an enemy even larger than disease? In the 7th chapter of Luke's Gospel, Jesus is walking toward a town called Nain. He is traveling with his disciples in a large crowd. As they approach the town gate, they are met by another crowd coming out. But this second group is not traveling. They are mourning. It is a funeral procession. A young man has died. And Luke gives us 2 devastating details about this situation. The young man was his mother's only son, and his mother was a widow. In the 1st century, this was not just an emotional tragedy. It was an economic death sentence. Without a husband, and now without her only son, this woman had no social protection. She had no provider. She was entirely vulnerable, facing a life of poverty and isolation. She is walking behind the body of her son, surrounded by the loud, public wailing of the village. And then, the two crowds collide. The crowd of life, following Jesus, meets the crowd of death. Notice what happens next. Or rather, notice what does not happen. The woman does not fall at the feet of Jesus. She does not ask him for a miracle. She does not even speak to him. There is no indication that she even knows who he is. She is simply weeping. There is no request. There is no statement of faith. But Luke chapter 7, verse 13, tells us what happens when Jesus sees her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Do not cry." His heart went out to her. Once again, the English translation uses the language of the heart, but the Greek word is splagchnizomai. Jesus looks at a woman whose life has been entirely hollowed out by death, and he is hit in the gut. His inward parts physically twist with the agony of her grief. He feels her ruin in his own body, and this violent, physical compassion demands an immediate response. Jesus steps forward, and just like he did with the man who had leprosy, he breaks the rules of ritual purity. He touches the open coffin. According to the law, touching anything associated with a dead body makes a person ceremonially unclean, but Jesus does not care. The gut-wrenching compassion of God overrides the religious protocol. When Jesus touches the wood, the men carrying the body stop. The entire procession grinds to a halt. The wailing goes quiet. Jesus looks at the dead body and speaks, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And the dead man sits up and begins to speak. And Luke records a beautiful, quiet detail. Jesus gave him back to his mother. This is what splagchnizomai does. It does not just feel sorry for death. It invades death. It stops the funeral. It reverses the curse. Nobody asked Jesus to do this. He was not responding to a desperate prayer. He was responding purely to his own visceral ache for a broken world. Pause for a second and see what has emerged. So far, we have watched this word move. We saw it over a vast, shepherdless crowd. We saw it touch a man ruined by disease. And now, we see it stop a funeral procession. The pattern is clear. Whenever human ruin meets the gut-wrenching compassion of Jesus, the ruin is reversed. Isolation becomes community. Sickness becomes health. Death becomes life. This is the physical reaction of the Son of God to the pain of the world. Up to this point, we have only seen how Jesus acts on this feeling. The Gospel writers have used the word to describe his physical body, but Jesus also used this word himself. When he wanted to explain exactly how God the Father reacts to our sin, he told a story, and he built the climax of that story entirely around this one heavy word. Up to this point, the Gospel writers have used this word to describe Jesus. They have used it as a lens to show us how the physical body of Christ reacted to the pain of the world. But Jesus also used this word himself. When Jesus wanted to explain exactly how God the Father reacts to our sin and our return, he told a story. It is arguably the most famous story he ever told, the parable of the prodigal son. In the 15th chapter of Luke, Jesus is surrounded by tax collectors and sinners, but the religious leaders, the Pharisees, are standing nearby, muttering in disgust. They believe God is holy, and therefore, God must be repulsed by these broken people. So Jesus tells a story about a father and two sons. The younger son does the unthinkable. He demands his inheritance while his father is still alive. In the ancient Middle East, this was the equivalent of looking at your father and saying, "I wish you were dead." The son takes the money, leaves the family, and squanders everything in a distant country. He ends up feeding pigs. For a Jewish audience, this is the absolute bottom. It is the ultimate state of uncleanness and exile. Finally, starving and desperate, the son decides to go home. But notice his plan. He does not expect to be a son again. He expects anger. He expects to be placed on probation. He prepares a speech, hoping his father might let him work off his debt as a hired servant. He believes his father's love is transactional. But Luke chapter 15, verse 20, shatters that assumption. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Filled with compassion. There is the word again, splagchnizomai. Jesus uses the most visceral, graphic word for physical emotion available in the Greek language. and he applies it directly to the character representing God. When the father sees the boy, covered in the filth of the pigsty, carrying the weight of massive disrespect, smelling of the distant country, the father does not feel vindicated. He does not cross his arms and wait for the boy to grovel. He is hid in the gut. His inward parts twist with agony and yearning for his broken boy. And just like we saw with Jesus touching the leper and the coffin, this violent emotion demands an immediate, rule-breaking action. The text says the father ran. In the 1st century Middle East, an elderly patriarch did not run. To run, he would have to pull up the edges of his robes, exposing his legs. It was considered undignified. It was socially shameful. But the gut-wrenching compassion of the father is stronger than his desire for dignity. He absorbs the shame himself in order to reach the son before the village can reject him. He throws his arms around a son who is still covered in the dirt of the pigs. He kisses him before the boy can even finish his rehearsed apology. The Pharisees thought God looked at sinners with quiet, holy disgust. Jesus tells them that God looks at returning sinners with splagchnizomai. This is the theological earthquake of the parable. God is not waiting for you to clean yourself up before he feels affection for you. When you turn back toward him, even from a long way off, his gut twists. He is physically moved by your return. He runs to close the distance. This changes everything about how we view God's posture toward us. But Jesus does not stop there. He uses the word one more time in another famous parable. And this time, he does not use it to show us how God looks at us. He uses it to redefine how we are supposed to look at each other. Jesus uses this exact same word to completely dismantle our definitions of who is inside and who is outside. In the 10th chapter of Luke, a religious expert stands up to test Jesus. He asks a theological question: "Who is my neighbor?" But Luke notes that the man was trying to justify himself. He wanted Jesus to draw a line. He wanted to know exactly who he was required to love, and by extension, who he was allowed to ignore. So, Jesus tells another story. A man is traveling down the steep, dangerous road from Jerusalem to Jericho. He is attacked by robbers, stripped, beaten, and left half dead. By chance, a priest comes down the same road. He sees the bleeding man, but he crosses over to the other side and walks away. A Levite comes next, another religious official. He also sees the man. He also crosses to the other side. We often judge them for being heartless hypocrites, but in their historical context, they had a deeply religious reason for walking away. According to the law, if the bleeding man on the road was already dead, touching his corpse would make them ritually unclean. It would temporarily disqualify them from their temple duties. They looked at a broken human being and saw a theological problem. They saw a risk to their own purity. They prioritized religious separation over human suffering. Then, a third man comes down the road, a Samaritan. To the original Jewish audience, this was an offensive twist. Jews and Samaritans despised each other. They shared centuries of bitter, racial, and religious hostility. A Samaritan was the ultimate outsider, the enemy. But watch what happens when the Samaritan sees the dying Jewish man. Luke chapter 10, verse 33. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He took pity on him. Once again, the English translation gives us a weak, polite phrase. But Jesus did not use a polite phrase. He used splagchnizomai. When the Samaritan sees the broken body of his cultural enemy, he does not feel a fleeting sense of sadness. He is hid in the gut. His inward parts are torn apart by the agony of the man in the dirt. The religious leaders saw a purity risk and kept their distance. The outsider felt a gut-wrenching agony and closed the distance. The physical tearing in his stomach overrides the centuries of racial hatred. It overrides the danger of the road. It forces him into the dirt. He bandages the wounds, pours on oil and wine, puts the man on his own animal, and pays for his recovery. When Jesus finishes the story, he asks the religious expert a simple question. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert cannot even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. He simply replies, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus tells him, go and do likewise. Do you see what Jesus is doing with this word? He is making it the dividing line of the kingdom of God. We like to draw lines based on right theology, right behavior, or right tradition. But Jesus bypasses all of that. He says the defining mark of a neighbor is not shared nationality, It is not shared religion. It is the willingness to let your gut be torn apart by the suffering of another person, even if that person is your enemy. The priest had theology. The Levite had religious duty. Only the Samaritan had the gut-wrenching compassion of God. And that brings us to the deepest truth this word reveals. Let's look back at the journey of this single, heavy word. It is so much more than polite sympathy. It is a visceral, gut-wrenching ache. We saw it look over a mangled, shepherdless crowd. We saw it drive Jesus to reach out and touch the untouchable leper. We saw it halt a funeral procession to give a widow back her only son. We heard Jesus use it to describe a father pulling up his robes and running through the dirt to kiss a rebellious boy. And we heard him use it to explain what it actually means to be a neighbor to our enemies. Every single time this word appears, human ruin is met by divine agony, and that agony always results in restoration. This changes everything about how we understand the incarnation. In the ancient world, the Greeks believed that the highest form of divinity was a state of apathy. They believed that to be truly divine meant you could not be affected by anything outside yourself. To the ancient mind, a perfect God was a God who felt nothing, a God who could not suffer, a God who remained totally insulated from human tragedy. But the Gospels present a completely different kind of God. Why did God become a man? Why did he take on flesh and bone? God took on a human body so that he could physically feel the pain of the world he was redeeming. He did not shout down instructions from heaven. He did not drop a theology scroll from the sky and leave us to figure it out. He came down into the dirt. He took on a human nervous system. He took on human inward parts, and he allowed himself to be hit in the gut by our grief, our sickness, and our spiritual exile. The writer of the book of Hebrews captures this beautifully in chapter 4, verse 15. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. We do not serve a stoic God. We do not serve a God who looks at human suffering with cold, calculating logic. We do not serve a God who is standing on a balcony, checking our performance off on a clipboard. When you are carrying a weight that is too heavy for you, when you are sitting quietly in a hospital waiting room, when you are grieving a loss that has hollowed out your life, or carrying the shame of a massive failure, God is not standing at a distance, politely feeling sorry for you. He is looking at your life, and he is experiencing splagchnizomai. His inward parts are moving for you. His own chest is torn open by your pain. This is the great, shocking comfort of the Christian faith. The God who holds the universe together is also the God who physically aches for your restoration. We have sanitized the word compassion in English because we are terrified of an emotion this heavy. We like our love safe. We like our boundaries kept intact. But the compassion of Jesus does not respect those boundaries. It crosses the dangerous road. It touches the unclean leper. It runs to the prodigal son. It feels the absolute depths of our brokenness. And then it walks up a hill to a cross to absorb that brokenness forever. If this study has helped you see Scripture with fresh eyes, consider subscribing to the channel. We explore these deep, beautiful layers of the Bible in every video. When you read the Gospels from now on, do not let the English translation soften the reality of who Jesus is. When the text says, "He had compassion," do not picture a gentle, distant pity. Picture a God who steps into the ruin. The word was never just a description of a feeling. It was the physical shape of God's love for a broken world.